Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the fifth Sunday of Easter for the week of May 18th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig into this week's podcast, and I am excited that we are continuing this Easter season. This is such a great season, and I think it is so important for us to really sit here and dwell with this and contemplate this and really reflect on what does this actually mean. When we think about what this actually conceptually all means on what the resurrection of Christ did, and then what is the fallout of that? What are the pieces that happen because of that? I think that's an amazing thing to be thinking about. And especially as I'm kind of giving a little bit of a teaser on where we'll be going with the science tie-in, we need to be able to understand this aspect of how things are tying together, how little things that don't seem like they're a big thing or doesn't seem significant end up being significant. Especially when we're looking at a lot of these texts that we're dealing with in this Easter season, it's a lot of these moments that are leading up to the crucifixion, and it's reminders of things that Jesus stated beforehand that then have more significance getting on this side of the cross, looking back at them and saying, oh yes, now I understand. Now I grasp more what was being talked about, what was being said. And at that moment, the disciples are not fully grasping it. And I think that's one of the things that we wrestle with, we struggle with. And it ties into the question that we had for last week, which was, what is something that seemed insignificant in your life that became super significant? And I got a wonderful, beautiful call story on how this person got called into ministry, how they were just attending a youth gathering, being a chaperone, being a bus driver, going to an evening discussion at the end of this gathering, and that barely anybody came. But the discussion was talking about how they were needing more people in the ministry, and that's when this person heard the call. Something that was easily could have been overlooked, easily could have been ignored, but it becomes super significant. And when we look at our own lives, there's plenty of those that I feel like typically happen. These little moments, these things that are big to us, that when you even maybe go and tell the person how big that moment was, it was nothing significant to them, but they're glad that they were able to have an impact beyond what they were able to understand at that time in that place. I know within my life, there's been multiple different people who have said things, who have done things that I know to them was insignificant, but had significant impact on me. And I think when we reflect on that and we think about that and we look at that from the perspective of what then the gospel is doing for us, what Christ really did for us was something that was super significant. And leading up to it, it didn't seem like out of the ordinary outside of the people who were following Jesus, understanding that there was something different about this person all along, but not understanding what the ramifications of all that would be. So let's just jump into it for this week. The first reading, and as we've been kind of talking about, we've been continuing to go through Acts, and the first reading then is from Acts chapter 11, verses 1 to 18. This, I would argue, is the text that most likely is going to be talked about more this week based off of where the other texts are. But I feel like this is the real meat and potatoes text this week. The apostles are gathered together, and Peter goes up to Jerusalem. And there's this discussion about why are you spending time around uncircumcised people and eating with them? And this is then where Peter gets this vision and talks about how he had gotten this vision and the Lord had said to him, go, Peter, kill and eat, coming from verse 7. And this is, again, recognizing at this point, this probably would have been meat that would have been sacrificed to other gods. And so thus Peter wants nothing to do with it and says, I am not going to let anything profane touch my mouth. The Lord insists and says, no, what are you meaning that this isn't clean? What are you saying that the stuff that I created is profane? And so out of that, then it leads into this meeting where Peter then is with these other men who we learn later are Gentiles, and are talking with them and accompanying them and walking through them and talking with them, and the Holy Spirit comes upon them as well, recognizing that they are not only baptized with water, but anointed then with the Holy Spirit. And what should I be to hinder that, is what Peter kind of ends his little discussion on. And this is what then gets the people who are questioning, stating, this is a God that we need to give thanks and praise to, that God is even giving repentance to the Gentiles, to the people that we're seeing as outsiders, that this is all coming together. This is all encompassing and much beyond just what we understand as the determined race. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 148, all 14 verses of it. This is a praise psalm through and through. And this is a praise psalm that is recognizing all the aspects of what God has done. It's recognizing the heavens and the heights and the angels and the sun and the moon and the stars. But it's also then getting into this aspect of recognizing the creation and the ferociousness at times that the creations can have, but yet also the mountains and the fruit trees and the cedars and the wild animals and the cattle and the birds, that all of this is done and is doing it in praise of God, and in trying to get us to recognize and acknowledge that all of this leads back to God. And that this then is to help us to understand the amazing connection that we should be having with our God and giving praise to God. The second reading, our epistle text this week, is out of Revelation chapter 21, verse 1 to 6. This is then this recognition on how there has been this transformation then. There is a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. And that this is where God is, the home amongst the mortals, that there is no more sorrow, there is no more crying, there is no more pain. There is this beginning of recognition that God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, that there is no more thirsting, that this is a place where all are satisfied. There is no beginning or end. This is something that's all encompassing, and we are able to give praise to God, acknowledging the beauty of what God has done. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 13, verses 31 to 35. This is John's telling of the Passover and when Jesus goes and meets with his disciples in the upper room. We have to acknowledge that earlier in this chapter is the foot washing that Jesus does of his disciples. Then he acknowledges that there is going to be someone who betrays him. And then we get into our text. And that here, again, remember there is more theology within John's gospel here, but it's this idea here of that I'm going to die to be glorified, and helping the disciples understand I'm only with you a little bit longer, but I want to give you one new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another, coming from verses 34 and 35. This recognition of us caring, our recognition of love, our recognition of not getting into these boundaries or putting these arbitrary boxes around ourselves, that is how people will recognize that we are followers of the way. We are the followers of Christ, that we are loving toward one another. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, and listening to a lot of different biblical scholars, having their different resources over there, and years of commentaries going through these different texts. So if you haven't checked that out over at workingpreacher.org and looked at some of the different resources over there, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but they also have art, prayers, hymns, the liturgical colors, daily devotions. This is an amazing resource that is packed to the gills with things to help prepare you for worship and continuing to be able to bring you closer in this relationship. As we are in this season of Easter, this is an amazing time to have a time to draw closer to God and recognizing the gifts of that provides us. And I think in a lot of times it's easy for us to overlook and, okay, we've gotten through Easter and now we're getting soon into the season of Pentecost and after Pentecost, but we forget the season of Easter. And there's a great season to really be a filling season, especially as a lot of our own personal lives this time of year start to get really busy. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt Divinity Library. Another way to also help fill you up during this season is checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter. The Roundtable has, to bring into the weekly preaching similar to like this, ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies in this weekly lectionary week after week. And the Green Blades Rising publications includes that along with a newsletter talking about different events and ideas on how to be more eco-friendly. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy the resources over there at Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. And that will be the first link down in the references section. Finally, if you are a high school student and you are trying to figure out how does all this faith and science stuff work and how does that work ethically, boy, do I have an opportunity for you. I would highly recommend checking out the Gus Davis Faith, Science, and Ethics Camp this year from June 21st through 27th at Gus Davis Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota. I'd highly recommend it. I have been a part of it the last couple of years. It's an amazing way to be able to connect with different high school students and be able to hear about how they are wrestling with these things and get great science, great theology, and how do we make this all work ethically. I'm really excited about it. The topic this year is the sweet life, getting granular with sugar and looking at and talking about how does that fit into scripture. So if you're interested in that, I'd highly recommend checking that link down in the show notes. When we talk about things of our world, and especially then trying to tie it into faith, there's a lot of times that there's the resistance that kind of happens because why are you trying to bring faith into science? Why are you trying to mix these things? And I can understand from the scientific perspective on how you're trying to take biases out. But there is also an aspect as a faithful person that we need to understand that the resources and things that we're understanding should also be affecting our faith life. And recognizing that we need to be bringing those two together, because if we are, like Jesus is calling us to do, to love one another, we need to understand how to love like Christ. And in order to love like Christ, we can recognize throughout the scriptures that Christ spent a lot of time acknowledging and looking at the little things that seemed insignificant. The Acts text this week brings up where people are trying to stay pure, trying to stay devoted to Christ, to the T, to the letter. And even as we've had the revelation of Jesus, we are still trying to stay perfect to what the Jewish law was. And this is going to lead to the beginnings of how do we have the Jewish Christians and the non-Jewish Christians and the beginning of that kind of separation that happens out of this. But the question then becomes, where are you drawing these arbitrary lines? Where are we drawing these things to recognize the differences between these, and how are we going to live up to these expectations? And especially when we're looking at some of the different Jewish law. And yet Jesus multiple times at different points kind of said, okay, we've gotten to a point where we don't need to do this for recognition of Christ because there's a different standard. There's a thing that has changed now. But we also have to acknowledge within that there's a process that has led to that change. And that change means, especially like when we're looking at the Acts context here, that the people of Israel is not just a small group. It becomes a bigger group. God's calling us to love all, not just love those who act and believe exactly the way that we do. There was an interesting story that I stumbled across this week coming out of the Twin Cities talking about how walleye, the state fish for the state of Minnesota, and fishing culture within Minnesota is a big thing. But walleye have been struggling in the state of Minnesota for the past couple decades that it's been really a struggle to really make sure that the populations of walleye are staying sustainable. And especially since it's such a desired fish to fish, it makes it really hard for a lot of these anglers when there's discussion on we need to look and think about what our actions are. Meanwhile, in Idaho, they're having the complete opposite problem. They are telling fishermen to fish as many walleyes as possible. We need to get walleyes out of these areas. And on the surface, it seems contradictory. And on the surface, it's like, what the heck is going on? But when we dig into a little bit of what the life cycle of walleye are, and then look at the differences of these different ecosystems on where they're at, it starts to make a little bit more sense. And it starts to get us to a place where we can start to recognize and acknowledge that this is a little bit more complicated than what we initially contemplate and think about. And I think that's where we can get to, but let's go through a little bit of fish biology here. So walleye are a fish that are known for cold waters. They need rocky bottoms. They need that colder temperatures. And especially as the ice starts to melt, the males will move into spawning areas in early spring when the water temperature is just barely above freezing. The females will come a little bit later as that water temperature gets more between 42 to 50 degrees. And at that point, deposits upwards to 100,000 eggs for them to be fertilized. Then, depending on the weather, the spawning process happens. These fish then hatch out of their eggs, eating through their yolk, and then start going for as fry, which is what they call small walleye, eating microcrustaceans as they slowly move forward. As these warmer waters happen, they then start to try to go into these cool areas, and they are hunters. They're little hunters. They prefer colder weather than other fish here in the Midwest of like panfish and bass, but not as cold as your trouts. But they're going to go through and eat small shiners and just eat small fish in general as they are again continuing to grow and get into their comfortable space. The problem that we have been running into, at least here in the Midwest and Minnesota in particular, is especially like this last year with how fast spring went from snow on the ground to, in fact, as I'm recording this, we had an upper 80s to 90 degree day in northern Minnesota. That's extremely fast. That our spring was less than a month, really, and we're in extreme fire danger where I'm at, where we really need rain, and the temperatures of the water and everything move so quickly. When you're hearing this process of what the fry of walleye are looking for, this makes it extremely difficult because a lot of these processes to be able to have the microcrustaceans, to have the female fish get to the areas to drop their eggs, this isn't all just, I go and do this tomorrow. It might take a period of time. It might need a few days for these things to happen, not just one day to this and then the next day to the next step. So as these temperatures are warming lakes faster, it's making it harder for walleye to thrive here in the state of Minnesota. Contrarily, when we look into Idaho, as there's been kind of some debates on the walleye getting there through some potential fishermen maybe dropping some walleye into the lakes to bring them into these areas, or maybe even just when they're releasing fish that there accidentally got to be some walleyes in there. You're talking about an Idaho coming off the mountains. So you're typically having that cold water runoff. So it's naturally these colder waters. It's naturally these rocky bottoms, which is exactly what they're looking for. The issue that the Idaho is running into is they're wanting to make sure that they bring back the salmon and steelheads. Meanwhile, where these spots where walleye have gotten, they have completely dominated the lakes, taking out perch, taking out trout, and there isn't necessarily natural defense mechanisms, and these fish are just sitting there waiting, and these are the types of things that they're just quite literally eat up. This is exactly the type of habitat that they would thrive in. The problem is there's no natural predators for these guys in the water, so then they just dominate and take over. And so all these native fish disappear. And when you're then trying to look at steelheads and salmon, reintroducing them into these areas that the ecosystem was evolved to be able to have them in these areas, and we've talked about it specifically with salmon, this then makes it extremely difficult because the salmon cycle allows for these fry, which these walleyes are just going to eat right up. They're not going to give them the time to be able to grow. And especially with them moving with their natural on how they do their spawning, it makes for this weird competition where the walleyes then just completely outcompete them. And so now you have where you're trying to have these reintroduction programs, you're trying to have this bringing these fish back and allowing them to be able to go through their natural cycles that they have been doing for thousands of years, are now severely disrupted because now there's a fish there that isn't commonly there. The thing that I find amazing when you really start breaking down spring migration and whatever the different species is, whether it's fish and how they're doing their spawning to birds migrating through, is the timing of it all. Yes, there's going to be years that are warmer or cooler, but they usually are staying within a range. If we're pushing that stuff, if we're accelerating things all the time, the problem is you're going to start getting where things are out of sync. The walleye in Minnesota are running into issues because of how fast that things are happening, that these fry are coming out and the microcrustaceans aren't there because there hasn't been time for some of the different plant growth to be there to be able to have these. Meanwhile, the walleyes then are also competing with new invasive predators themselves in Minnesota with zebra mussels and realizing that zebra mussels seem to be affecting especially small fry of walleye as well. These introductions of new things are actually affecting the network on how these food webs work together. When we're children, we're taught food chains and we see it as like fish eating other fish and slowly getting bigger and bigger. But when we really look at it as a biologist or an ecologist, we start really seeing how complex these food networks are, that there's a lot of different factors. You take birds, for instance, you take hummingbirds, when they come back, there's reasons on why different flowers flower at different times. Because by the time they get here, there's at least something that's flowering to be able to give them energy. They've traveled thousands of miles. They're hungry. They need energy to eat. We start messing with this. We start having where we consistently are having springs earlier and earlier and faster and faster. It makes it harder for some of these cycles to be able to keep up. And there isn't naturally a quick and easy fix to be able to do that. It's not like us adjusting to different technology. This is stuff that's been over periods of time, a long extended period of time. We have to be able to see that and acknowledge that and care for that. We have to be able to love. Just because something is seen as different, just because it's seen as something that's challenging, which is not that far off of what Peter gets asked here in Acts. Why are you eating the unclean meat with these people that aren't followers of the way? And Peter is basically saying, if I don't, who will? If I don't, who is going to show them that love and care that has transformed our lives? Who's going to? Jesus' final commandment to his disciples is telling them to go and care for people. Not to divide the people on whether or not they are part of their movement or not. Go and show love. Go and show care. And I think as we actually dig into that further and think about that further, we start recognizing these arbitrary lines of even stopping it at humans aren't in the text. I give you a commandment that you love one another, just as I have loved you, and you should show love to another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Does love stop just because it's suddenly a non-human? Can we not love and care for the creation? And if we're trying to show love in a way that is as if God is showing love, would God not care for God's own creation as well? Would God not recognize and think about the influences and the impact that all these different small things will have on each other and see that and acknowledge that? We see that in his ministry. Why wouldn't Jesus do that? Why wouldn't we be then trying to do that? We've talked about last week on how the impact of what Jesus was talking about, we couldn't fully comprehend. And thus, when we're looking back at like the internet and how far and vast and big it has gotten compared to what we anticipated it would be, we then have to be able to acknowledge and see that that's the same thing now when we talk about loving and caring for each other. And what does that mean? That means everybody. That means everything. That means showing praise, like we talk about in the Psalm this week, of acknowledging everything, not just what we create, everything around us. It means understanding complicated food webs. It means acknowledging that there's going to be times that we're going to have to care for something that seems insignificant initially. To recognize that that love is actually something that's quite important. Love is simple in concept, but very difficult to fully do. Love takes a lot of work and time and effort, and especially if you have been in any committed relationship with another person, you recognize how difficult that is. Much less recognizing it at the scale that God is calling us into. Not just with other humankind, but God's creation in and of itself. How do we interact with God's creation? So the question I have for you this week is, where do you show love? And how do you show love? Where do you show love? And how do you show love? Because answering that question and acknowledging that it's bigger than just how I'm doing it with my family, how I'm doing it with my friends, how I'm doing it with my community, how I'm doing it with my country or world citizens, or how am I actually affecting the ecosystem around me, and acknowledging that the decisions and stuff that I do impact them as well, I think is important. And I think when we start recognizing and acknowledging that, we start seeing that, yeah, there's some differences that are a little concerning. In Minnesota, walleye are very important to the native community and the non-native community alike. And figuring out how do we take care of that, and how do we help, and how do we make decisions so that for generations people can still enjoy walleye. When we take the Idaho community, they're trying to make sure that their native fish are there for centuries to come as well. And in that case, it means that they need to reduce dramatically the amount of walleye, if not remove the walleye out of these areas, because they're causing a lot of harm. It's preventing them from being able to actually enjoy their heritage and understanding where their whole community is built around. That's part of how they're showing love, because they're recognizing the aspect of removing these native fish from their communities has been hard on their ecosystem. It's been bred around the idea, and that is a major part of their ecosystem. We have to acknowledge and understand we're part of something that's much bigger. And in doing that, that means that we have to show love. We have to show care. And that means seeing beyond the differences. Seeing beyond that you're seeing it one way or I'm seeing it that way. That doesn't necessarily mean they're fighting against each other. We're supposed to be actually trying to move toward a place of love and care for each other. It means that, honestly, it typically means we need to listen more to each other instead of necessarily pointing a finger and judging. And that's hard. That's not easy work, but that's loving work. And if we're to the point where we can quickly condemn, we're probably at these moments where we need to have more time listening. And especially when we look at the Acts text this week, Peter does a lot of time of listening with these Gentiles. And it's at that point that the Holy Spirit comes and is able to be with all of them. And I think it's a good reminder with where we're at as a world, that we have to be able to listen to each other. If we're so fast with pointing the finger, it's not going to be helpful. It's not going to be good. And I would argue in certain ways that God's probably not there. We have to be able to listen to each other, because that's part of what we are called to do. We are called to love. And if we can't do that, we have a lot of problems. Loving is not easy. Loving is, in a lot of ways, quite difficult and hard, but it's necessary. If we're going to consider ourselves followers of the way, we have to be able to listen to each other and let our love speak sometimes where our voices can't. We have to let our love speak sometimes in ways that we don't have the words for. Love is an action in a different way than our words can ever say. And again, if you've ever been in a committed relationship, you know the aspect of love as an action is something that is very tangible. And there's a lot of ways that people can say how much they love and care without ever saying a word. And I think a lot of times we need to be able to do that and acknowledge that. And sometimes it means that we need to be able to see connections, like how fish are being hurt, or how these bigger food webs are actually a way of caring for each other, making sure that all are provided for, making sure that they're able to build something that is sustaining, not a flash in the pan. And that's hard, it's difficult, but necessary. And especially within our faith, I'd argue the same. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.